This is Bishop Michael Burbidge, and you are listening to the Walk Humbly Podcast.
Welcome to the Walk Humbly Podcast. I'm Billy Atwell, Chief Communications Officer for the Diocese and your co-host. If you haven't already, make sure you rate this podcast and write a review on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher, and we're also now on Overcast. Sign up for our e-newsletter at arlingtondiocese.org. You can also follow Bishop Burbidge on Twitter at Bishop Burbidge. If you'd like a question to be asked on this podcast, please send us an email, info@arlingtondiocese.org, or you can just post that question on any of our social media accounts and we'll take a look. I welcome your host, Bishop Burbidge. Bishop, how are you doing?
Doing well, Billy. Great to have this opportunity for a podcast, and certainly grateful to all who will be listening to it.
Absolutely. Before we get into our first topic, the news of the day is really the storm Hurricane Florence that's really battered a lot of North Carolina and South Carolina, and it's even working its way up, and I know parts of Southern Virginia. I know this is an issue that's dear to your heart. Talk a little bit about what you were thinking as you saw a lot of the impacts of this storm.
Yes, a great deal of the impact is in my former diocese where I served for 10 years. And so as I look at the news coverage and see the towns that are mentioned, I have very vivid recollections of being in those exact places. So to see the devastation, the destruction, like all of us, is just so sad to watch. And we know that the path of the hurricane is so slow moving that there's concern for the days ahead also. And so I ask everyone in our diocese to please be praying for all those impacted by the hurricane, and especially in its aftermath as we begin to recover. And we also may be going to our parishioners in the near future to also provide other opportunities for us to assist and to support those in need.
And we've seen the strong response of the faithful of this diocese to previous natural disasters. So anyone that wants to keep tabs on that in terms of fundraising efforts and so on for disaster relief, just stay tuned with arlingtondiocese.org. Anything new is going to be posted right to that.
Right, and we will be getting word out to the pastors. Too.
Absolutely, yeah, for parish collections and so on. All right, our first topic, two major announcements out of Rome this week. The first was that there was a meeting of top church leadership in the U.S., Cardinal DiNardo, Cardinal O'Malley, Archbishop Gomez, and Monsignor Bransfield, the General Secretary for the U.S. Conference of Bishops. They met with the Holy Father to introduce proposals being considered in the U.S. to combat the child sex abuse crisis and to create a more transparent and concrete process for investigating allegations against bishops. Without providing too much detail, Cardinal DiNardo came out of that meeting saying that the meeting was fruitful and that he was hopeful. The second major announcement was that Pope Francis will convene all of the presidents of the world's Episcopal conferences in February to discuss and find solutions to the crisis we once again find ourselves in. Bishop, I'd be curious, what are your thoughts on these revelations? But for people that don't know, what is an Episcopal conference? So who are these people that he's calling together in February?
Right. So in February, the Episcopal conferences is the assembly, the assembly of bishops. And in each country. And the assembly will elect bishops from within to serve as our leaders. So you have a president, a vice president, a secretary, and treasurer. So the gathering in February is of the presidents of each of the conference. So as you can imagine, the presidents of an Episcopal conference is in frequent contact with bishops throughout the country, and so should be very alerted, aware of the needs, the pastoral and spiritual needs throughout the country. And so it's very wise on Holy Fathers to bring such leaders together. But going back to the meeting that you mentioned with our own leadership meeting with the Holy Father, as I had said in a previous podcast, that when bishops meet in November, which we do every November in Baltimore, we are well aware that we have to come out of that meeting with concrete actions and steps. What is going to be different as we continue to address this issue, as we continue in a specific way to look at for the mechanism that will hold bishops to a greater and more rigorous accountability. And so, as I said previously, we're not going into that meeting unprepared. We want to hit the ground running the first day. And so the proposals, the plans that will be discussed with all the bishops is getting some discussion with the Holy See. So the Cardinal DiNardo and the other leaders were there talking to Francis. As you mentioned, Cardinal DiNardo did not give specific details, but was fruitful. In other words, these are probably very good proposals and plans that you should be discussed as a body, Bishop, and then bring back for approval. So I'm very happy that there's such an aggressive approach that we're going to hit the ground running day one, and God willing, come out with some very significant and specific changes to announce to the faithful after our meeting.
Because it would seem that there's going to be a need to collaborate ongoing with the Vatican, because anything that would relate to a bishop has, I'm sure, canonical implications within church law, because who are they ultimately accountable to? The Holy Father. But there's some maybe local mechanism for reviewing cases? Because that's been the question that's been raised. Why didn't we know who knew what? Well, this would be more clear if we knew the process and that was connected to the Holy Father.
Right, absolutely. A respectful balance of both.
Right. Another bit of major news related to Pope Francis was that he accepted the resignation of the Bishop of the Diocese of Wheeling, Charleston, which is the whole state of West Virginia, Bishop Bransfield. Bishop, what would you like to say about that situation? That was a bit surprising for a lot of folks.
Well, it was accepted very soon after his 75th birthday, which is not always the case. And in addition, with the acceptance, the Metropolitan, who is Archbishop Laurie, the Archbishop of Baltimore, was appointed administrator immediately, with also a mandate from the Holy See to conduct an investigation of reports of sexual harassment of adults. And so it's very serious. But it's very important to note that this is an investigation. And so we have to allow for that investigation to take place through a very deliberate process, and with the ultimate goal of the truth surfacing. And so Archbishop Laurie announced that while he will oversee the investigation and have to submit a report to Rome, that the specific duties carrying out the investigation will be delegated, which he's allowed to do, to a layperson with great expertise and background in this area, so that all voices are heard. And so there is Archbishop Laurie, in fact, just yesterday, addressed the people of the diocese in a talk, a homily. I would even recommend our listeners to Google that and listen to the Archbishop's talk. It's very well done and gives a fuller explanation. But again, it's an investigation. We allow that to play out with respect to everyone involved, with the ultimate goal of truth surfacing.
There was another interesting story that surfaced this week, and this last week, and it has received a lot less attention than other stories, but it was about Bishop Kevin Rhodes of the Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend, who was cleared by a district attorney of any wrongdoing following an allegation of sexual misconduct with a child. In fact, it appears from the reports that the allegation was not credible from the start, and that Bishop Rhodes hadn't even met the alleged victim until he was an adult. And there was no evidence that there was any sexual contact with that person at that point even. And that's something that Bishop Rhodes has been standing by since the beginning. The county prosecutor stated this. I would be interested in your response, Bishop. He said, quote, "This has been a case of a public airing of mere speculation of impropriety with no foundation. In this case, the leaking of what turned out to be an unfounded report did unnecessary harm. This has done a disservice to actual victims of sexual abuse. It has also caused significant and unnecessary harm to Bishop Rhodes." It was a really interesting report from the prosecutor to say that. What has been your response to this case and this news?
Well, first of all, I'm very grateful for that statement, because it mentions the victims, a disservice to victims who have to bring forth their experiences and want to do so. With being heard, and so when kind of the fuzziness of this case, it seems like it takes away from that process, you know. So I'm glad he mentioned the victims first, because that's the most important. But also, I felt very sad for Bishop Rhodes, because the first thing that most people see, as I did, was a big headlines and a big photo of Bishop Rhodes. And then you read it, you start reading the details. If you start reading beyond the headlines, you're like, what is this? This is very fuzzy, very cloudy. I'm not even sure what it is. But he had to endure the waiting to be cleared, and he was. And so I guess it goes back to what I was saying earlier, just previously. We allow for due process. and respect for everyone involved with the ultimate goal of truth. But we have to, not just read headlines, and we have to not just jump conclusions. That's not fair to anyone involved in a process like that.
And it's to discover truth no matter what that truth may be.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So there's another story which is much more positive.
Okay.
You're going to be traveling soon to Grapevine, Texas for the V Encuentro. The main goal of the V Encuentro is to discern ways for the U.S. Church to better respond to Hispanics and Latinos and to strengthen the ways in which Hispanics and Latinos respond to the call to the new evangelization as missionary disciples serving the entire church. Tell us about what you hope to see accomplished there and how that might impact our diocese.
Well, again, there's been a lot of preparation. We've been preparing for this meeting, this national meeting on a local level. And I've had the great opportunity of participating locally and hearing from our Hispanic youth and members of the community. It's been very interesting. And now there's going to be this national encuentro. And from everything I am reading and hearing, it is going to be a very spirited, very joyful gathering. So I'm very much looking forward to it. I think we have like 47 representatives from our diocese attending the Encuentro. And so you're right. It's to invite, to engage, form Hispanic Catholic youth, young adults and families to live out their baptismal call. So I hope it re-energizes people to that. It's invite all Catholic leaders. This is a great moment to invite all Catholic leaders to engage and accompany Hispanic communities, which these communities are such gifts and blessings to our diocese and to our church, to identify opportunities for Hispanic Catholic pastoral leaders to serve in leadership within our church and our diocese, and really to help to develop a new wave of faith formation and leadership development for Catholic Hispanics. So I'm very much looking forward to this trip, and I pray that it's fruitful for all who participate.
Our next topic is about an upcoming opioid conference that we're hosting. So one of the most devastating challenges facing our country is the opioid epidemic. It's unique in that it's indiscriminate. The opioid addiction doesn't affect just the rich or the poor. It doesn't care what race or nationality you have, if you're Northern or Southern. It seems to impact every demographic of society. So Bishop, you called for, on September 29th, the diocese to host a conference titled Seeking Hope and Healing in the Midst of the Opioid Crisis. It's being held at Good Shepherd Catholic Church in Alexandria. You brought this up with leadership, Bishop, here at the diocese at the Chancery months ago, and it seems to be an issue that's really close to your heart. Why is that, and what do you hope for this conference to accomplish?
Yeah, well, it really is, because we know that we are really, when you read the data and the statistics and all, we are really in a crisis. This is truly a crisis. And I think that practically everyone, myself included, people that you know and love, we are all aware of someone impacted by this crisis. Many times, the addiction coming through what began very innocently as prescription drugs. And it led to this horrific addiction, which has taken the lives of so many people. So we are in the midst of a crisis. And so I think what I'm calling for is to bring our people of our diocese together. First of all, to pray. We will be praying for God's healing for all those impacted by this crisis, to be provided information. I think there's not only the statistics and all, but what is at the root cause of this crisis? How did we get to the situation we're in, and what can we do about it? And we may be hearing stories, too, of people who have been impacted and how they have, with the grace of God and help of others, found healing. But we know that practically every family in one way or another is touched by this. And so we always feel stronger when we come together in the midst of a crisis to see what we can do to help each other. And that will be part of the conference also. Our own Dr. Michael Horne from Catholic Charities is one of our speakers, and he just does a great job, especially in this area. So as you mentioned, Billy, it's open to everyone. I think it will be a very productive day, and God willing, maybe a source of healing for others.
Absolutely. You mentioned Dr. Horne. He's local here to us. He works for Catholic Charities here in the diocese, but he's called nationally to speak about a number of topics, this being one of them. We're very lucky to have him. So folks listening, if this is an issue that you are interested in, this is a great opportunity to hear some witness testimonies, but also hear from Dr. Horne, who is going to be there. Bishop, before we get into questions from the faithful, we recently posted pictures from a mass for the Ministry of Lectors at St. Charles Borromeo Seminary. Talk a little bit about what that ministry is in the formation of a seminary.
Oh, it was a great joy to be back. The seminary asked me to preside at the ceremony, which included 3 of our own seminarians, but also men from other dioceses. So it was a beautiful celebration. So in the formation to priesthood, there are various steps before you ordain a priest. So one is what we call candidacy. You're accepted as a candidate for theological studies. And then you're approved to receive the ministry of lector, which is in a formal way identifying this candidate as someone sent to teach and proclaim the word of God. And then you receive the ministry of acolyte, in which you can assist the priest at the altar and bring Holy Communion to the faithful and to the sick. And then you're ordained a deacon. And we call those preparing for priesthood a transitional deacon, because the transitional diaconate is leading to, God willing, the ordination for priesthood. So what I say to the seminarians is that every time, because you don't go forward in any one of those ministries unless you receive an official call from the bishop, like saying, I'm calling you to this ministry, which is based on his own observations of the seminarian's progress, as well as the formation team who have given a recommendation. So I said to the seminarians, even though lector is not ordination, please see that as the church affirming your vocation. Because when a candidate is in the seminary seeing if he wants to be a priest or not, he's discerning, but so is the church.
Right.
The church is discerning too. And so when they receive a call to ministry, I said, see that as the church working through your bishop, affirming your desire to continue your priestly formation. So it's not ordination, but it's a special and joyful day. And indeed it was on Saturday. And I did have the opportunity. We have a number of our seminarians at St. Charles Seminary. So I did have an opportunity afterwards to meet with them as a group. And I did tell them, Billy, I did say, let me begin by telling you, all the parishioners that I talk to, they're all worried about you. They're worried about how you are doing in this time of crisis within our church. And I want you to know that. So how are you doing? And to the man, everyone said what we all say, that various emotions as we go through this crisis, including sadness and anger, confusion. But to the man, everyone said that at the seminary, they are receiving tremendous support, that the formation team is addressing this issue clearly and directly, providing opportunities for them to meet individually with priests, to meet as groups, small groups, to discuss the issues, and to offer any counseling or support that may be necessary. So, as I've said many times, I have great confidence in the seminaries that we are using and in leadership and the support that are being given to them.
And it's so good to hear they're continuing to say yes to the call. I remember when I first heard the analogy or the description of the church has to respond, but so does the individual. And I think that sounds kind of like a dating relationship. Right. When I was dating, I wouldn't just say, you're going to marry me. It's, you're seeking each other out. And exactly. Is this the call that we're both, called to? The person might feel called to the priesthood, but the church might not respond, right. And vice versa. Right. So it's got to be where they both meet. And I feel like that's like a good analogy in any vocation, is that both have to say yes for this to work. And these are some of those stages.
Well, they have the great confidence that I do, that while we are suffering and while there are going to be serious consequences and purification, God's not going to leave the void there. He's going to fill the void, right, and with new life. And these young seminarians, who I'm so proud of, such great men, see themselves as the ones who will help the Lord bring His church forward.
Absolutely. So we've got we got some questions from the faithful. The first was not from any particular person, but we have been hearing this just enough that I felt like it would be worth bringing to you. So the question was, they're seeing the recent priest changes announced and posted on the website and so on. I think there was 5 people that were given to assignments.
Parochial vicars, yeah.
Right. And the question was, is there something behind that? They're hearing these stories of things that have happened in other decades, but other states also, where people were moved around with ill intent. Do you mind addressing that?
Yeah, I would like to address it, in fact, because I also heard from one of my pastors that a number of his parishioners brought that concern forward. And I have to say, that it's very unsettling to me to hear that. I understand that, we are in a very, critical situation within our church, and there's suspicion and there's doubt. But there also has to be fairness and justice. And all those priests, the 5 priests who were transferred, are very good priests, very faithful, who desire nothing but to serve the Lord and his church. And just because we're in a crisis, for them to be put under that cloud, to me, does not seem fair.
Yeah.
And it does not seem just. We have given the assurance that there is no priest with a credible accusation in priestly ministry. We are not transferring priests from one parish or reason because of this issue that was just mentioned. These are good men, and they deserve. What happens is when you identify a pastoral need, and one of the parishes involved, there's really a pastoral need here for a priest to be assigned to that parish to fill a void that was there. And so it's like anyone in business know that personnel, this is what happens. There's a domino effect. So if you move, if you move this person to this position for all the right reasons, because he's the guy for the job at this moment, well, then guess what? Then there's an opening here.
Right.
And so you have to start filling those voids. It's done in discernment and consultation with the priest. I have the help of a personnel board that assists me in deciding, but these are great priests. So I'm just cautioning our faithful I understand concerns and understand the reasons for suspicion and things like that. But let's also be mindful of the respect and the good reputation that are owed to others.
And to welcome your new priest in love.
Yes.
All right, so our next question is from Elizabeth at St. John Newman's Parish. She says, as the church reflects on how they will enforce justice related to the abuse of children over the years, I draw your attention to another relevant issue and vulnerable group. This is the abuses afflicted on our incapacitated loved ones, mostly the elderly, by predatory guardians. This is an unregulated system, and some of the worst abuses of our elderly occur when these charlatans and frauds deprive these poor souls of their rights. This happened to my family. There was a movement to pass legislation in Virginia to toughen guardianship, especially regarding the rights of visitation. I would like to know the church's stance on this and if they will lobby the state legislature to promote and pass it when it comes up again this fall.
Well, I'm very sorry. Very sorry to hear, what Elizabeth stated, especially that this has happened to her family.
Yeah.
It's so sad because, as we know, every person, especially the weak and the sick and the elderly, are deserving of compassionate care in environments that make them feel safe and protected. So I'm very, very sad to hear this. This should not be happening. And so I remember my own parents when they were, going through a great deal of illness. You saw the need, though, to be advocates for them. There's just so much going on in a time like that, and in medical facilities, and many times people are overwhelmed, and good people trying to help, but sometimes people are just overwhelmed in different facilities, and maybe some are not as strong as others. So as a son, you feel the need, I'm going to stand as the advocate here and watch. And I was very fortunate that my parents were both in facilities where the care was everything that you would want it to be. But I understand that's not always the case, as Elizabeth said. And so, yes, most definitely, I would support any legislation that would help to secure that. And I will work with the Virginia Catholic Conference, on any bill that is coming forward, and maybe even be proactive in helping to assure all of our elderly, especially the weak and sick, of the care they deserve.
So, Elizabeth, if you're not familiar, the Virginia Catholic Conference is the public policy arm of the bishops of Virginia. So Bishop Nest out in Richmond and Bishop Burbidge here in Arlington. You can learn more about them and some of the legislation they're following at vacatholic.org. You can contact them also if you had specific questions about certain policies or legislation that's being considered there. Our next question is from Laura. She's at St. James in Falls Church, and she has a short but simple question. Is it possible to change God's mind with prayer?
Laura, it has not worked for me. I have tried many times, and it has not worked. No, of course. I mean, I think, I always think in the gospel when Jesus says to the blind man, "What is it you want me to do for you?" So the Lord does ask, "What is it you want me to do for you?" So I think that we should pray, Lord, I really would ask specifically of this from you, this request. I'd like to make this request for you. But as we know, we have to conclude every prayer with the perfect prayer. Thy will be done. That's the ultimate prayer. Thy will be done. Lord, from everything, from my perspective, this is what would be best for me. So I'm asking, but I'm trusting that your will. And as we know, God has his whole plan for us in front of him. And so everything that comes our way is for our ultimate good. We may not see it at the particular time. We may not realize it. We may be confused by it. But we can trust that God, who knows us, who looks into our hearts, who has a divine plan for us, will only do what will lead to our greater happiness, and certainly to his glory. And I think that sometimes, if we look back on our lives, I know I do frequently, I look back on my life and I see that's true. Like, I look at something and said, I never would have asked for that, or never would have desired that, but you gave it to me, Lord, and look what it has done. So I think any of us can do that. If we reflect back on our lives, God's plan does work. So maybe not so much putting the emphasis on trying to change his mind, but maybe, Lord, help me to understand and to see your will more clearly, so that my yes can be complete and without condition.
Beautiful. Is there anything, we went through a lot of different topics here and then some questions. What are your final thoughts, Bishop, and if you would send us off with your blessing? Yeah,
thank you, Billy. Know that, in our reading today, St. Paul encourages us that as the body of Christ, there should be no division. And I pray, especially at this time, it's a critical time in our church and in our society, for us more than ever to live and to reflect that unity that is ours as God's holy family and as brothers and sisters in Christ. So I do suggest to our faithful that whenever they come forward to receive the Holy Eucharist, especially at this time, the Eucharist, which is the source of our unity and our consolation, to pray for that grace, to reflect the oneness that is ours in Christ Jesus. And I ask our Lord God to bless all of us as we continue to strive daily to be faithful to all that we have promised God and his church and one another. And we know that we can only do so. We can only live in such faithfulness if we walk humbly with our God. Thank you for listening to the Walk Humbly Podcast. Make sure you check out more episodes on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. You can follow me on Twitter at Bishop Burbidge, where I offer spiritual reflections each morning in the gospel and share photos and updates of what is going on in the Diocese of Arlington. Stay up to date with news, event information, inspirational content, and more by subscribing to our e-newsletter at arlingtondiocese.org.